Donna Anderson. I'm the Director of Student Civic Engagement, and I have the pleasure today of introducing the moderator for our panel. Dr. John McCarthy is a professor of history. He is also the coordinator of Robert Morris's Oral History Center. Dr. McCarthy.
Thanks, Donna. Thanks, everybody, for coming today to Constitution Day. This year, we decided that we wanted to focus on the greatest generation, quote unquote. The phrase "the greatest generation" comes from a book that was written by Tom Brokaw, who was the longtime anchor for NBC News. And the book is probably about 20 years old or so now. And Brokaw was, interested in American history, and had, just kind of noticed that the generation of Americans who were young, grew up during the Great Depression, and then lived through and fought in World War II, and over 11 million Americans served in World War II, and then came home and sort of presided over the greatest economic growth in American history, oversaw the Civil Rights Movement. It's just an extraordinary 30-year period in American history. And so Brokaw coins that term, and it's become kind of part of American popular culture. And historians debate how that can get kind of created and that kind of thing. But there is no question that this generation of Americans lived through extraordinary times and did extraordinary things for the United States. And the connection between them and Constitution Day really is especially clear with World War II. World War II is probably the war in American history that most Americans agreed was a war that was between freedom and tyranny. And so we're really excited today to have a panel of people who are going to talk to us about their family members and their contributions in terms of the greatest generation. So I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then each of them will talk for about 10 or so minutes. They'll share their stories, and then we'll open it up for some questions at the end. We have here Joe Smido, who's the associate editor and member of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette editorial board. And Joe wrote a wonderful article about the greatest generation and how now they're starting to kind of disappear as time goes on. A couple years ago for Memorial Day for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, so he's going to go first. We have Rick Terhanko, who is from Boardman, Ohio, and he's going to be speaking about his father, George Terhanko, who has a really extraordinary experience as a soldier in World War II. That's really, really remarkable. We have Larry Tomei, who is the vice provost here at Robert Morris University, and Larry is going to be speaking about 4 of his uncles, all who served in World War II. And then we also have Marianne Rayfuth, the dean of the Robert Morris School of Education and Social Sciences, and Marianne is going to be speaking about her father, who also served in World War II at D-Day especially. So thank you to all of our panelists, and we'll open with Joe.
Thanks for inviting me here today. I'm delighted to be here. The appreciation for the greatest generation was some time developing. As John mentioned, it was Brokaw who started the conversation on this. And his experience was that he went to Normandy to cover the 40th anniversary of D-Day. And he was very impressed with the people he met and the stories he heard. And by the time of the 50th anniversary celebration, when he went back, he had a very profound appreciation for what these people had done and the contributions they had made. And he was on Meet the Press with Tim Russert, and he said at one point, "I think this is the greatest generation any society has ever produced." And that, as John said, is why his book, which was published in 1998, became known, was titled The Greatest Generation, and the term has stuck. And the book is full of the accounts of men and women who served in combat and on the home front, helping to win the war and preserve freedom. And I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the reasons why I think this generation is so great. And one has to be its capacity for endurance. the people who served in World War II, the people of this generation, they were children of the Depression. And they had all the privations of the Depression to experience before they ever went off to war and experienced all the privations that entailed. And Adam Hochschild, in a recent book about Americans who served in the Spanish Civil War, reminds us quite vividly of what the Depression was like. He says there were 34 million Americans living in households with no wage earner, families rummaging in trash bins and garbage dumps for food, unemployed steelworkers and their families living in idled coke ovens, and millions of people streaming westward from the Great Plains under vast clouds of topsoil turned to dust. That was a heck of a prelude to war. They didn't have an easy childhood, and they weren't going to have an easy adulthood either. I think this generation is remarkable for its clarity of mind and its capacity for discernment. Remember, there was no internet then. There were no blogs. There was no social media to connect these people who were living in different parts of what was a very rural country. Many people had never been on a boat. They'd never been on a plane. They'd never been out of their hometown. Hochschild tells us the telephone use even declined during the Depression because people couldn't afford it. And so it must have been very difficult for them to make sense of what was happening on the other side of the world, to make sense even of what had happened at Pearl Harbor, and yet to have understood what needed to be done, and to have done it without complaint. And we had this discussion at work yesterday just by accident, and we asked ourselves, could we pull this off again today? The nation is so fractured, it is so polarized, could we do this again? And I hope, we never have to answer that question. The Greatest Generation also stretched our level of tolerance, our level of inclusion. African Americans went into the military during World War II and were initially relegated to service roles. And then they served later in segregated units in combat. And they experienced great humiliation during this period, despite the great sacrifices they were making for the war effort. And Brokaw interviewed the family of one African American soldier who was stationed during part of the war at Fort Hood. And there were some German POWs at Fort Hood. And they were allowed to use the PX, but the African American soldiers in U.S. uniform were not. And I think that speaks volumes about what they experienced. However, their contributions were recognized, and their service was so valiant and so committed that it helped to desegregate the military entirely by 1948. And also these contributions helped to plant the seeds for the civil rights movement that would come later. Women served in non-combat military roles. I'm going to mention one of them, Scotty Lingelbach, a little bit later. They served in war factories that kept the arsenals full, and they served in defense leagues. I have a family friend whose sister, Annie Mae Lohr, lived in the Mon Valley in Washington County, and she was in the Defense League, and she stood a certain number of shifts scanning the skies for enemy bombers that were thought to perhaps be targeting steel mills at one point. What a remarkable story of service. And women, of course, were displaced from many of their wartime jobs when the men came home from the war. But they accomplished so much that it definitely aided the fight for equality later. Scotty Lingelbach says in Brokaw's book that her wartime service was empowering and that it gave her the sense that she could do anything that she needed to do. I'm struck by the nonchalance, almost, with which the people of this generation performed their roles. They weren't braggarts by any stretch of the imagination. Eileen Broderick, who also is mentioned in Brokaw's book with her husband Tom, said that when veterans came home from the war, they didn't see any need to talk about what they had done. First, she said, everybody did it. And she said you didn't want to brag because chances are you'd meet somebody who had it worse than you did. But the result of that, as I said at the beginning of this talk, was that appreciation for their achievements were a long time coming. They were hiding in plain sight. And as a professor at La Roche told me a couple of years ago, he said, we almost took them for granted. Fortunately, Brokaw's book helped end that, helped to get the discussion going. They didn't just win the war. You know, they came home, they started the baby boom, they started a housing boom, they fueled an industrial boom, but they did a lot more than that. They served on the front lines of the Cold War, which came next. They rebuilt large portions of Europe, large portions of Asia. Much of what the world looks like today is because they rebuilt it. And they also committed themselves to the long-time monitoring of the effects of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In December, I was privileged to write the obituary for Neil Wald, who spent 3 years with the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission in Japan. And he was one of the first, if not the first, to document the prevalence of leukemia among Hiroshima survivors. You know, that is kind of a niche service that I think sort of gets lost in the shuffle when you talk about the war effort and the post-war effort. But I found it very compelling and was very honored to have written his obituary and wanted to mention his service to you today. The World War II generation set the national standard for patriotism and sacrifice. Everything done today by anyone is measured in terms of that. That's why we're sitting here today talking about them. And being in their presence can be quite moving. A couple of years ago, I interviewed a guy who organizes trips to the National World War II Memorial in D.C. And he said that the tourists who were there, they get so excited when busloads of veterans show up to tour the memorial, that there's this current of electricity, this current of excitement that runs through the crowd when these guys get off the bus. And it's like, wow, these are the guys that did it. Yeah, they are. They're the guys that did it. It's amazing. It's amazing to think about it. They left an amazing record of their contributions with books and letters. They didn't brag, but they told us, forthrightly what they did. And the letters particularly, they freeze the 1940s in time. It's something that we'll always have to remember them, to study them, and to take inspiration from. We're lucky to have them. These guys, they never stopped fighting. When the war was over, they came home and they joined the ranks of the VFW and the American Legion. And through those organizations, they fought for veterans' health care, a robust national defense. They sponsored education programs in public schools to help children develop a sense of history and patriotism. And in a sense, these folks never went on duty. They're still on guard for us. Their commitment remains today. But they are a vanishing generation. In 2014, I wrote a story about Brokaw's book. I made a list of everybody he profiled and then did some research and found out how many of them are still left. And at that point, at least 71% of the people that Brokaw had interviewed and featured in his book had died. And they're dying at a rate of about 435 today, and by 2036, they'll all be gone. And we should remember, too, that 73,000 Americans who served in World War II, that their fate is unknown. They've never been recovered. We don't know what happened to them. We don't know where they are. So I decided, one of the people Brokaw profiled is a woman named Scotty Lingelbach, as I mentioned before. She left the University of Kansas during her sophomore year. She said because all the boys were gone. That was her joke. She said there was no reason to stay there anymore. Joined the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and her job was she joined the Waves and was assigned to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And her job was to ferry around secret messages, and she was one of the first to learn that D-Day had been launched. And when I interviewed her in 2014, she was 92 years old. She was still hitting the gym 3 times a week. She was a rabid KU basketball fan, still very active in a lot of ways. So I thought, I'm going to track her down this week. I'm going to tell her, I'm speaking to this group at Robert Morris about the greatest generation. What do you think I should say? What would you say if you were here? So I reached her son, Randy, who said that his mom hasn't been well the past couple of years. She doesn't even have a phone anymore. But he said, I'll take your questions to her and get her to answer them. And so the email I got back from Scotty is so full of humility and patriotism that I think it just absolutely represents this generation and what we're talking about today. So here's what she said. I don't think we deserve to be called the greatest compared to the founding fathers or those who fought to preserve the Union during our own Civil War. Our service was an expression of our patriotism and love of freedom, and we were willing to do everything we could to serve our country. So I think I'll stop there.
Good afternoon. My name is Rick Terhanko. I'm going to speak specifically about my father. My father was George Terhanko. He served in the 83rd Infantry Division, 331st Infantry Regiment, 2nd Battalion F Company. He was in World War II in Europe. He was drafted and inducted in the Army in October 1942. Okay. He was inducted in 1942. At that time, he was 30 years old. Seem to be having some trouble with the mic. Okay. Believe it or not, I'm new at this. He joined the 83rd Division in Camp Atterbury, Indiana. At that time, the division was known as the Ohio Division. Did his basic training in Camp Atterbury, did his advanced training in Tennessee, Kentucky, and then the 83rd was moved to Camp Shanks, New York, where they shipped out for Europe, actually to England, in April 1944. The 83rd was held in reserve during D-Day. They did not partake in the original D-Day landing. They landed in France on or around June 18th, depending what historical article you read. They landed at Omaha Beach, though. Came in through Omaha Beach. They took the defensive positions near Carrington, France. It was at this time that my dad had the opportunity to meet General Eisenhower. He was digging a foxhole, and General Eisenhower took his tour of the beachheads and came upon him digging a foxhole, spoke to him, interviewed him, made the newspapers back in little Youngstown, Ohio. Around the end of the month, they relieved the 101st Airborne in Carrington. On July 4th, the 83rd Division left Carrington and moved south toward Saint-Denis, France. It was about a 4-mile hike to Saint-Denis, turned into a 6-day battle. In the first 24 hours, the 83rd lost over 1,400 casualties. The Germans had opened the floodgates on the Tot River, flooding all the fields that they were approaching through. Turned them into swamps and also gave the Germans knowledge of the high grounds that the Americans were going to take, which they had their artillery and mortars zeroed into. On July 2nd, the 2nd Battalion, my dad's battalion, fought through the hedgerows to the village of Oxay. I have a lot of knowledge of this area, as I have a very good friend who lives in Oxay. And finally, on the 10th, the 331st captured Saint-Denis, France. By that time, the number of casualties had grew to almost 3,300 men that they lost. I was in Saint-Denis, France last year, and I was taken in to meet the mayor, and I was in the mayor's conference room, and sitting over his conference table, hanging above his conference table, is a flag from every state of the United States. Hanging over his seat is the Ohio flag. They still remember that the Ohio Division, the 83rd Division, was a division that liberated them. Also in the month of July, on July 24th, my dad was promoted to company first sergeant. He told his captain he would take the position until a better replacement was found. He was first sergeant at the end of the war. So the 83rd continued to fight through Brittany, liberated Luxembourg, Belgium, where they were in the Battle of the Bulge, the Ardennes Forest, Herkin Forest. They then continued on, entering Germany. They set some records going into Germany. They were the first division to reach and cross the Rhine River. They set a military action record. They did 200 miles in 13 days. They earned the nickname of the Ragtag Circus. There was a newspaper reporter there, seen them, and noticed that they had commandeered any vehicle that would run, whether it be German, civilian, or any American vehicle they could get their hands on. And they moved the whole division 200 miles. After that, the official name of the 83rd Division changed to the Thunderbolt Division. They were the first division across the Elbe River. There's a famous picture of the bridge that they constructed because a couple days before they completed the bridge, the president died. The bridge was dedicated to him. This put them about 40 miles from Berlin. They were the first division to make contact with the Russians. Then they were pulled off the line 2 days before VE Day. On a more personal side, well, the 83rd fought through 5 campaigns: Normandy, Brittany, the Ardennes, Rhineland, and Central Europe. On a more personal note, on my dad was awarded the Silver Star for actions taken in Guy, Germany. He had told me about Guy. He said it was just as bad as the hedgerows. It was a small village, but for whatever reason, the Germans refused to give it up. They had stocked every house in that village with ammunition and arms. Americans were having a hard time getting through, starting to get disorganized. They were pinned down. My dad took a small group of men, and they advanced and took out the German machine gun that was holding up the rest of the unit. He received the Bronze Star. He received 4 Purple Hearts, 3 of them in the month of July, all in the hedgerow country in France. He was hit in the shoulder with a tracer round. He was hit in the hip with a piece of shrapnel that came pretty close to his tailbone. Both of those were just removed out in the field, and he continued on. The third one, he was shot through the left knee. It went in one side and came out the other side. He ended up getting shipped back to the aid station, spent about 2 weeks in the aid station, felt he was going to lose his company and be reassigned, so he walked out of the aid station, hitched whatever rides he could back, caught up with the company, and spent the rest of the war with them. This wound, he was shot by a 14-year-old Hitler Youth teenager. Germans had the kid chained to a tree to cover their retreat. He just happened to be the unlucky one. Picked up a piece of shrapnel somewhere else. We don't have the official record, so I'm not sure of all the locations. He was buried 2 times. First time, well, the first 2 times were in France. Both times were in France, I'm sorry. Him, his captain, 4 or 5 other guys were coming into a village. German artillery started shelling the village. They ran into a house, found there was a bomb shelter or some kind of basement in the house, dove into that, and the Germans got a lucky hit, had a direct hit on the house and brought it down on top of them. It took them about 5 hours to dig themselves out after the bombardment, and that was with help from the outside. Fortunately, no one was injured, but they were just stuck in the basement of a house. Second time was they were getting a hot meal brought up from the rear. He was standing next to a slit trench, directing the men to the chow line. They heard mortars coming in. He said he heard one and it sounded awful close, so he dove in a trench. Mortar hit right where he was standing next to the trench and caved the trench in on top of him. He said all that was sticking out was his legs from his knees to his feet, and the men dug him out before he suffocated. Third time, wasn't actually buried, but himself and a squad of men were crossing a field. 2 or 3 German tanks come out of the tree line on the other side of the field, came after him. He dove into a former German foxhole. One of the tanks spotted him, drove over to the foxhole and pivoted back and forth several times trying to cave the foxhole in on him. Tanks went on their way. Him and his guys got up and they went on their way. So I've got a lot of knowledge of the Normandy area, the hedgerow area. I have a real close friend that has a home there, as I mentioned in Oxay. I had the opportunity to go over there last year. I got to stand on Omaha Beach and look at the bluffs that the guys coming in on D-Day had to face, and it was just awe-inspiring. I also got to stand in my friend's backyard, which overlooked this area where they lost 1,400 men the first day. It's nothing but farmers' fields now, but it's all open ground as far as you can see. In his backyard, there was 5 machine gun positions that the 83rd had set up to cover the guys coming across those flooded fields. The people in France still respect the Americans for what they've done. I could probably talk for another 30 minutes of the people I met and how much that they still respect Americans. My friend is actually English, works and lives in England. This home in France is a vacation home as we would know it. They chose to buy that to take a vacation. He spends probably 4 months a year there, just tracing American soldiers. He has actually, out of his own money, put a memorial in the backyard. Has my dad's picture on it and has the company captain's picture on it. Just this last year, he dedicated another memorial to another soldier that he had found a canteen to and returned it to him in Florida. And this is all out of his own money. These are just private memorials. So that's all I really have. If anybody has any questions afterwards, I'll be more than glad to talk about it more. Thank you for having me here today.
As the computer comes up here, I want to tell you a story, not about 4 uncles, but a story about 12 brothers. In World War II, it was not uncommon for entire families of brothers to be drafted into the Army or the Navy. So this is an initial story about the 4 Sullivan brothers who all perished because they were on the same ship in World War II. A family lost all 4 of their sons in one attack on the USS Juneau. A couple of months later, the Nilhant brothers, all in the Army, were on the same mission together, and they were all killed at the same time. It started, as you might expect, a process in the United States of saying, hey, wait a minute, all 4 sons were killed at the same time. And it started a new policy called the sole survivor policy, which basically says you cannot have all of the children be stationed together at the same time. And for those of you that might have seen Saving Private Ryan. Yeah? Okay. That was based loosely on the story of them trying to find the fourth brother of another family who had lost 3 of their sons in the war. But this was not uncommon in the United States during World War II. We were fighting for our lives. We were fighting for the world here. And fortunately for the Tomei family, our 4 all got to come home. This is a picture that was run in the Akron Beacon Journal. That's where I'm from originally, Akron, Ohio. Just after my father and his 3 brothers came back from World War II. And I think it was Joe that was saying that, when they come back, they really didn't talk a lot about what they experienced. My father on the left was the oldest of the 4 brothers, which in an Italian family puts him in a special position. I am the oldest of my cousins. There's probably 30 of us, each of the 4 brothers, and they had a sister, so there was 5 of them altogether. We have a special place in an Italian family, for those of you that might be Italian, that, to carry on the family story, to know what's going on. But my dad was very, very quiet about it. My dad went to the Pacific Theater, fighting with our allies over there against Japan. The other 3 brothers, Johnny, Victor, and Fred, all went to the European theater. All 3 were in D-Day. My Uncle Freddie, who's the youngest of the bunch, sustained the most serious injury. He was literally shot in the head and spent a couple of months recuperating before they brought him back to the United States. My 2 middle uncles were able to make it through with their Purple Hearts, but without too serious of an injury. My dad, who served in the Pacific, also got a Purple Heart. We've lost three of them already. The youngest, my Uncle Freddie, is still alive. We see him every November when we have our Tomei family reunion, which has everybody that shows up. But my Uncle Freddie is, like I said, he's still alive. He won the Purple Heart. He won some other awards as well, but we didn't know it. We didn't know it until just recently. My 2 middle uncles both passed away since 2002, but my dad, he just passed away last November. Okay? We lost him. At his funeral, as is the custom in a lot of places, the veterans of foreign wars were there, gave him a beautiful ceremony, and they handed me his flag. Sorry. What we didn't know, was they handed me, in addition, a plaque that was to go on his tombstone. And on the plaque it said, Purple Heart, Bronze Star, Silver Star. And I looked at my brother and my sister and I said, "Did you know that?" And they said, "No. He never told us that." We went back to the online records now, which are kind of neat. You know, you can go online and look at these records now. And sure enough, in his separation that he got after World War II, it had those awards on there. He never showed us that. And that was kind of what Joe was saying earlier. These folks, they just, this was what they did. This was their job. I never got a chance to meet my grandfather. He passed away before I was born. But I did meet my grandmother. They were both directly from Italy, talked only Italian. So I really didn't get a chance to talk to my grandmother very much. You know, when you're 2 or 3 years old, you don't know what's going on. She passed away when I was about 9 years old. But my Uncle Freddie, and I've got a soundtrack here, he was actually interviewed by the Akron Beacon Journal a couple years ago. I won't play it now, it's about 7 minutes long. But he talks about his experience, how he was wounded so seriously. And his last statement is just what our folks have been saying here, and I'm sure will be followed by Dean Rafeth. He said, I didn't have it so bad. There were other people that had it a lot worse than I did. And here was a guy laying with a steel plate in his head. And you can see that it was a special group of uncles that I got to know as I was growing up. It was pretty impressive, pretty impressive. And I'll tell you one more story and then I'll stop. I once asked my dad, I'm a grandfather now. I've got 4 beautiful grandkids. And I once asked him, I said, Dad, I said, you grew up in the 1920s, in the Depression. You fought in World War II. You saw everything that happened in the last part of the 20th century. He was 97 years old when he died. That's pretty good. My uncles were all in their 90s. My youngest uncle is 92 right now. So they live good lives. But I asked my dad one time, I said, Dad, I said, what's the biggest difference in the generations? You know, what do you see as the biggest change between you and me and my daughters and my grandkids? And it's something that I share with a lot of people whenever I'm in a position kind of like this. And he said, just beautifully, he said, when I was growing up, and this is my dad now, so when I was growing up, there were things that my father couldn't give me that I needed. He said, we went hungry sometimes. You know, other people might have had it worse, but there was things that I needed that he couldn't give me. He said, so when I was a father, I tried to give you the things that you needed and maybe some of the things that you wanted. And I said, yeah, I can remember some things that, you know, not everything I wanted, but a lot of things. He said, I've watched you. When you had your girls, you were able to give them everything they needed. Okay? Quite a bit of what they wanted. And you had to be careful not to give them things they didn't need. Okay? He said, so this last generation, they're going to get everything they need, everything they want, and a lot of things that they shouldn't have. And that was his description of the generations. And I thought, Dad, you got it right on the button, right on the button. So as we talk about the greatest generation, think about all the things that your grandparents, maybe your great-grandparents now, gave the world by their participation in World War II and by their many contributions that they gave to this United States, and be proud of them. Thank you. Back in here for you.
Thanks. I don't have a lot of specific details about my dad. He's passed away for a while, and I would have had to go back to our rec room in my mom's basement to dig out a lot of the material that we have from his time in the service. What he would tell me came out in bursts over the years, and I recall it from the age I was when he told me that, with that kind of developmental level that I was at the time. He was in the Navy. His name is Robert Kunkelmoller. He was from Northern Kentucky. They lived in a house, 4 children in a one-room house, a little tiny, tiny house. He joined the Navy when he was 17. I guess his parents must have signed for him. I'm not sure, but he, patriotism, adventure, and with no money, as Larry pointed out, terrible, terrible teeth. And he had heard that the Navy would fix his teeth. So he enlisted, and they fixed his teeth by pulling every one of them. And he had dentures at 17. And the way I knew about that was he would often say, like grumbling, like, I'll never have a set of dentures like that Navy dentist made me. Because a lot of excellent doctors and dentists were conscripted, and he got a great, great set of teeth. And he was mostly stateside initially. And again, these things would come out with like some kind of prompt. I think at some point I was discussing with him some moral dilemma or choice. And he said, Mayor, when I was in the Navy, I was a clerk. And I think it was at some central headquarters. It was somewhere in the Midwest, like maybe Michigan. And all the orders to send people everywhere were oral or handwritten, and then they had to be typed on a manual typewriter and then sent. And my dad was always, he became an accountant. He was always careful, good clerical skills, good typist. So his job was to type all the orders, sending guys all over the U.S. and the world, both theaters. So he said, that was me. That's what I did. I was the guy. And he was constantly bribed to change orders because it was a matter of life or death. Were you going to France or were you going to Spokane? And he said, I never did. I never did. It would have been wrong. And then he said to me also, I was afraid of the brig. And so it was to think there was no electronic record, there was nothing. It was this huge movement of men and materials handled all basically by hand, So eventually, though, he became a pharmacist's mate. He didn't know how to swim when he joined the Navy, and he never learned. But he became a pharmacist's mate. He gave shots literally to thousands of guys with no training. And I think they must have been extremely painful because he never even put a Band-Aid on us, growing up. Toward the end of his tour, he contracted tuberculosis. And at that time, there was no treatment for tuberculosis. So, eventually, before I get to his experience at D-Day, he was dying in a Navy hospital. He was written off. And the Navy was experimenting with a very experimental drug, streptomycin. And my dad is one of the first people in the world to have received streptomycin because he had nothing to lose. And he was able to recover. But he had significant lung damage, and he died in his early 70s from a condition related to that TB. So in many ways, I feel the war killed him. He was considered a disabled veteran because it reduced his breathing capacity to such a great degree. And he was very active all his life in disabled American veterans organizations. But his D-Day experience, we were watching some kind of movie toward the end of his life about the Normandy invasion. And he said to me, Mayor, a lot of guys didn't make it to the beach. I said, what do you mean, Dad? He said, well, they died in the water. They drowned. And I watched them. And what it was, the soldiers were all on ships and the sailors loaded the soldiers into little, dinghies, rowboats or something, lowered them from the big ship, and then they went on the beach. And the way my dad describes it, the water was very rough, and the ships, many of them, overturned, and the soldiers drowned, and they didn't stop for them, because they were in an invasion. The goal was to get to the beach. And so the sailors just kept loading the soldiers, and the soldiers kept going on the boats, and many of the boats overturned, and many of the sailors drowned. And my dad said to me, I watch them, and I see them every day. And that's really what I know about his service.
That was really wonderful. We just heard some really remarkable stories about service in World War II. Before we open it up for questions, I'm just going to kind of frame this really quickly. My grandfather, Joe McCarthy, his name Joe McCarthy in the 1950s. Yeah. I asked him about that once. I said, so was it hard being named Joe McCarthy in the 50s? And he's Irish Catholic. And he said, I love the guy. Of course not. So the conversation ended. But he also did, of course, served in World War II. Grew up in a like an Irish city neighborhood in the city of Pittsburgh. There were 8 kids in his family. My dad has 65 first cousins. He's the oldest of 10 kids. Enormous family. Like 4 guys slept in a bed. Very, very poor. He served in World War II, and really probably before he entered the war had no idea that he would ever become like a middle class suburban American. That was something that whenever you're in the greatest generation and you're in your 20s, that's like it's the Great Depression. That's not going to happen. And after World War II ended, of course, he got the GI Bill that a lot of veterans benefited from, and he used it to go to Robert Morris and get an accounting degree. Graduated in 1950 and was actually one of the golden colonials before he passed away. And he was always amazed that like his grandson could like teach at a college, and that's something else that's important to understand about that generation that kind of makes them unique, and it's kind of a warning sign to us in 2016. They grew up, and Larry mentioned it with his father's comments too, with the expectation that social mobility would continue generation to generation. And one of the reasons why we look back on this generation as extraordinary, aside from World War II and aside from the Great Depression, is because the American economy grew at 5% a year, the unemployment rate was low, inflation was low, and there was an expectation that that kind of prosperity would last forever. And we have found in the last 30 years that it has not. And so when we look back on World War II, we also look back at a generation that experienced that kind of success. And it's a question for Americans today is, can we also kind of achieve that as well? So that's just something else to kind of think about with my own family's experience with World War II. Well, I will assume that everyone is just in such awe of our presenters. We're going to have our provost, Dr. Dave Jameson, is going to give us some concluding remarks here before we end this event. So thank you, Dr. Jameson, for also being here.
I want to tell you a story of 2 guys from Pittsburgh, one from Tarentum and one from New Kensington. My dad from Tarentum, Tad Jamison, my Uncle Bill from New Kensington. They went to join up right after Pearl Harbor, as a lot of guys did. And Bill was selected, and he ended up being a tanker for General Patton, fought his way all across Europe. My dad was rejected on physical grounds. He wasn't physically able to serve in a combat billet. And one of the reasons we won this war, remember, is we not only outfought the enemy, we outproduced them. And so my dad was one of those guys. My dad's on that plane. He worked for the Glenn L. Martin Aircraft Company, building planes during World War II, and it's another part of that greatest generation of the guys who couldn't serve, but served in a different way. This is a treasured thing in my house. These are inspiring stories, and all of you students who are here today, you'll never forget what you've heard today, and I won't either. And I want to thank all of our panelists. I want to thank John for organizing the program. I want to thank all of you for being here, and let's never forget. Thank you very much.